All right, let's jump right into this explainer on Chapter 10, Approaches to Working with Young Children with Specific Learning Disabilities. Today, we're going to completely demystify how we identify, understand, and actually support kids who face some pretty unique learning challenges. If you've ever been fascinated by how the human brain works, why some brains just learn totally differently than others, well, you're in exactly the right place. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining learning disabilities, look at cognitive training and mnemonics, explore the learning strategies approach, weigh the pros and cons of direct instruction, and finally, dive into twice exceptional learners. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Defining disabilities. We really need to understand the baseline rules here, because figuring out exactly what counts as a learning disability in early childhood is actually a huge challenge. Believe it or not, there are over 90 different labels used in professional literature, which is kind of wild. But generally, there are two major ways we define these challenges, and they're completely different. The federal IDEA definition, it focuses on a gap, usually a 2-year gap or more, between a child's academic potential and their actual performance. The DSM-5, on the other hand, zeroes in on the symptoms themselves, looking for persistent struggles in specific subjects. Think reading, writing, spelling, and mathematical reasoning.
Now, when we're talking about very young kids, specifically 3 to 5-year-olds, we usually hit pause on using the heavy phrase specific learning disability. Instead, states use the term developmental delay. We use this for a child who is generally 2 or more years behind normal development. Why do we do this? Well, it gets them early intervention while they're considered at risk without unfairly misidentifying or labeling them before formal schooling really even takes off.
But here's a really interesting modern problem we're facing in early education. Lately, there's been this massive push for heavy early academics. And because of that, we've seen a steep decline in traditional early childhood activities, things like open play, art, music, and dance. The irony here is that missing out on those activities actually hurts the development of crucial pre-academic skills, like visual memory and word development. So in our rush to push academics, we literally removed the exact activities that help prevent learning difficulties in the first place.
Okay, moving on to Section 2. Cognitive training and mnemonics. Let's look at how we can actually change how a child processes information from the inside out.
Imagine teaching a child to be the director of their own brain. That is metacognition, and it's the absolute heart of cognitive training. It isn't just about memorizing facts. It's a way to actually modify a child's learning behavior. By teaching them to use self-instruction and really internalize their learning strategies, we're basically teaching them how to think about their own thinking. It's a total game changer for self-learning.
And to help kids store and retrieve that tricky material, we use mnemonic strategies. These are basically clever little memory hacks, and they generally fall into 3 distinct types: verbal mediation, visual imagery, and superimposed meaningful structures. By breaking tasks down and giving the brain a specific tool to hold on to, we cut out the distractions and really build up their confidence.
For example, you've probably used the acronym HOMES to remember the Great Lakes, right? Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. That is a perfect, simple way to scaffold a child's memory process. It's a superimposed, meaningful structure. It connects new, potentially overwhelming info to knowledge the child can easily grasp, making the whole thing manageable and far less frustrating.
All right, Section 3, the learning strategies approach. Here, we're shifting our focus completely from the what to the how. A great example of this is the Strategic Instruction Model, or SIM. This is a brilliant way to safely scaffold a struggling student's learning. Instead of just throwing them into the deep end, it moves carefully, step by step. It goes from pre-testing and describing the strategy all the way down to advanced practice and generalization. It keeps everything totally predictable while absolutely respecting the child's developmental age.
To make that sequence super easy to remember for your future classroom, just think of it like putting training wheels on a bike. Step 1 is the model. You literally talk aloud to yourself so the student hears your exact thought process. Step 2 is practice. You let them try it verbally and actively, giving them a ton of help. And Step 3 is feedback. You give corrective feedback while gradually decreasing your support, basically taking those training wheels off until they can ride totally independently.
Section 4, direct instruction. Let's dive into the highly debated behavioral approach.
Now, with direct instruction, there's a pretty massive trade-off. On the plus side, you get a highly organized mechanical approach. The materials are expertly sequenced, the goals are crystal clear, and kids get immediate feedback to reach mastery.
But the downside? Because it's completely teacher-led and heavily scripted, children kind of become passive participants instead of active thinkers. And honestly, there's no point in teaching content this way if the child is having difficulty with the mental process itself, because direct instruction completely ignores how specific children process information.
Finally, Section 5, Twice Exceptional Learners. This is what happens when giftedness and disabilities actually overlap. When a child's giftedness masks their disability, or vice versa, they fall into the twice exceptional category. This means they are gifted and talented, but simultaneously have a specific learning disability or developmental delay. Because these traits can hide each other, these kids are incredibly prone to being misidentified. Actually, most teachers just aren't professionally trained to spot them, especially in kids under 6, before formal academic testing even begins.
A defining characteristic of these learners is asynchronous development. Imagine a young girl reading complex chapter books miles ahead of her peers, right? She's showing this incredible conceptual understanding, but at the same time, she might be struggling immensely with basic math, writing, or just making friends. Her development is completely out of sync.
So, if you see a student exhibiting these contrasting characteristics, they aren't just trying to be difficult. You might notice severe perfectionism, getting easily frustrated, or giving up completely on tasks that bore them. They might have sky-high verbal abilities, but still be academic underachievers who deal with social isolation. These children desperately need a specialized, whole-child approach that challenges their incredible intellect while supporting their specific delays.
The absolute best strategy here? Leverage where the child excels to address where they struggle. Many gifted kids are super passionate and excel in one area while minimizing all others. We can use frameworks like Howard Gardner's 8 multiple intelligences, which map out different ways people learn, like musically or visually, to provide meaningful context for them. We need to enthusiastically teach them how they learn, not how a typical developing child learns.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. How will you move away from the typical learner standard and ensure every unique mind thrives in your care? The reality is, every single brain processes the world differently. Whether it's recognizing a twice exceptional student or using metacognition for your own learning, how will you embrace the fact that no two minds are exactly alike? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Chapter 10, and keep exploring these incredible learning strategies.